Hello and welcome to Amnesty International and Fight for the Future's third Salon on Generative AI as a part of our work opening the exploration of emerging tech to human rights activists. You can find all of our Salon recordings and info on upcoming events at emergingtechforactivists.com. I'm Leah Holland, Campaigns and Communications Director with Fight for the Future. I use they or she pronouns and I'm based in the Pacific Northwestern US. We're about to have a really interesting and timely conversation about the future of AI and social media. With the US elections looming, deepfakes easier than ever, people talking about what ChatGPT says as gospel when nobody on this planet understands how it really works, and a whole lot of hand waving about the end of the world. It's probably impossible to know exactly what's going to happen next with this rapidly changing technology. What we need to know is how to think about it. So today, in this tight, accolade-packed panel, we've pulled together human rights activists, researchers, trust and safety experts, including one who's deep in the guts of using and interrogating AI tools as a part of his creative process. So let me get out of the way and hand your eyeballs off to Michael Kleinman, Director of the Silicon Valley Initiative at Amnesty International.
Hi, guys. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining, and a huge thank you to our panelists. I am thrilled to introduce today's panelists. We are joined by Ramneet Bhullar, she, her, who's a digital rights campaigner for open media and who looks at community concerns and navigating misinformation and fake news and how we do so in the age of generative AI. Brandi Geurkink, she, her, who's a senior manager at the Mozilla Foundation and who's going to speak on how generative AI is creating a new marketplace for data at the detriment and to the detriment of public interest researchers. We're also joined by Tim Boucher, he, him, who's an artist and AI activist, who's going to speak on the illusion of AI moral authority. And we're joined by Sarah O, she, her, who's a co-founder at the social media network T2 and was formerly on the trust and safety team at Twitter. And she's going to speak about how T2 is using generative AI to promote positive community norms. So each of our speakers will speak for about 3 to 4 minutes. And then, as Leah said, most of the time will be a Q&A. Any questions that you guys from the audience have, just please use the Q&A function. At the bottom, we will record it and we will do our best to make sure that those questions get asked. So without further ado, I'll turn it over, and the order we'll go in is Ramneet, Brandi, Tim, and then Sarah. And if I mispronounce anyone's name, 1,000 apologies. And with that, Ramneet, please take us away.
Thanks for having me, folks. Quick intro about myself. I'm Ramneet Bhullar. I'm a digital rights campaigner at Open Media. We're a grassroots digital advocacy group that primarily operates in Canada and the US, and we work to keep the internet open, affordable, and surveillance-free. I lead the freedom of expression work at Open Media. So as you're all aware, the way that publicly available AI tools have progressed this past year has been one of the fastest technological advances we've seen since the internet. We're seeing this huge breakthrough moment where technology that only existed in just a few labs is suddenly in the hands of millions of people in our everyday lives. Generative AI has numerous benefits, like making mundane tasks easier, it's creative, and can help people communicate efficiently. I've seen plenty of people using this technology to plan vacations, write their cover letters, write their Instagram bios, but it does have its drawbacks. At Open Media, we see our role as making the internet a better place for people, and generative AI seems to likely have potentials in both directions. We're still trying to wrap our heads around the consequences it can and will have, but as a grassroots community, we want to put our members first. So we asked them what they think, what are they worried about, and what are they hopeful about. So in May 2023, we reached out to 300,000 community members via survey and received 4,000 responses. And by far, the single biggest concern was believable misinformation. Overwhelmingly, 90% of participants were worried about believable misinformation. And as large language models advance, the lines between human written content and AI generated content become increasingly blurred. It makes it harder for people to distinguish between what is fact and fiction. especially since social media platforms want clickbait. They want content that draws people in, and their algorithms prioritize the most engaged content, whether it's real or not. We also saw 88% of respondents were concerned about the potential for bad faith actors to manipulate AI in order to harass or attack people. The potential harms of truthful seeming misinformation are broad. They can cover political smear campaigns, they can cover hate speech amplification down to intense harassment of individuals. I think one of the contributing factors to the spread and acceptance of misinformation is the existence of user echo chambers and confirmation bias, particularly in the context of social media. They can reinforce echo chambers, making it hard for individuals to access diverse perspectives and credible information. And the timing of all this right now, I think, seems particularly poor. As some of you know, in Canada, we recently passed Bill C-18, the Online News Act, and platforms like Meta and Google have already threatened to pull formal news sources from their outlets. So that means anytime you're trying to share an article on Facebook from a Canadian news outlet like the CBC or CTV, you'll be prompted not to view it. Ultimately, we're concerned about the direct implications of policies like these, coupled with a rise of large language models that'll lead to the spread of more fake news as truthful information is slowly squeezed out. So our first campaigns on these issues are still in the works, but based off of our community's enormous concerns about misinformation, we're advocating for strong safeguards to spot the difference between AI and human written content. And that doesn't and can't always mean government ministers telling people what is true and what isn't true, but we need ways of denoting the source and credibility of information in both our public and private lives. AI companies need to do everything they can to tag their content so that people know if it's AI produced, but we know that some AI content isn't going to be tagged. And that's why we need non-AI companies to step up by providing better sourcing and fact-checking of viral news stories. Additionally, they should enable users to easily identify the authenticity of a message from a familiar source versus an account that was suspiciously created 2 hours ago. So this is all getting started, and that's a lot for us to figure out right now, but I'll leave it there and I look forward to your questions.
Hey, thank you so much. That was an amazing way to kick it off. And Brandi, over to you.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. So there's no shortage of reports about the dangers of large language models and generative AI, from bias to unemployment, misinformation, copyright infringement. These are all very serious issues, but there's another really significant one that's being neglected in the AI conversation at present. The sudden rise of generative AI products is causing platforms like Twitter and Reddit to tighten their grip over once public data, which poses serious consequences for public safety and the right to access information. Public data includes tweets, Reddit threads, Facebook posts, and other content that percolates online every day. Independent researchers and public agencies depend on access to this data to do their work. For example, disaster response teams in the US have used Twitter data for years to identify when to evacuate people during hurricanes, and more recently during school shootings. Social media across several platforms has been used to conduct long-term studies into the rise of depression and anxiety in teenagers, as well as how vaccine skepticism and misinformation spread online in the early days of the pandemic. As this data is becoming more lucrative, public interest researchers are being priced out of a new commercial marketplace that is emerging around it. The flood of generative AI products like ChatGPT that have come onto the market over the past months has suddenly made public data more lucrative than ever before, because the conversational nature of this data is basically premium fuel for training large language models. As a result, platforms are tightening their already quite tight grip over this data introducing massive paywalls that are impossible for researchers and others working in the public interest to afford, or even shutting down access entirely. So a few months ago, Reddit announced that they will start charging tens of thousands of dollars for access to their API. And they also shut down PushShift, which is a project that provides data used widely by community scientists, by thousands of Reddit moderators, by civil society and academic researchers. That was the latest move in a trend that was started unsurprisingly by Twitter earlier this year, who started charging researchers over $42,000 a year for access to an API that was previously free, and has started sending threatening legal letters demanding that researchers delete all data that they once had access to if they're not willing to pay up. So this trend is likely to continue until access to data for public interest researchers is protected and is codified in law. Because it's not already, we're unfortunately letting public safety follow the whims of Wall Street markets. The newly formed Coalition for Independent Tech Research, which I'm on the board of, in addition to my role at Mozilla, is advocating for platforms and policymakers to ensure that this access remains open. And I hope that you'll join us and we can engage on these campaigns together, and looking forward to talking more in the Q&A. Thanks.
Brandi, thank you so much. And if you want to put a link to the coalition, we'll try and make sure that users can see it, or that participants can see it as well. And Tim, over to you.
Hi, thanks. My name is Tim Boucher. I live outside of Quebec City, also in Canada. Over the past year, I've used generative AI to produce and publish 110 short ebooks. They're mostly pulp science fiction, dystopia, and the topic is kind of what happens when humans hand off power to AIs. I've also worked for the past 8 years or so in trust and safety for a social media platform for blockchain that includes policy, content moderation, and doing product work. So I've got kind of an interesting view from both worlds, as an artist, as a creator using these tools, but also as someone who has had to deal with abuse on platforms and in products at scale. And my work kind of fuses those together creatively. So I recently got into this conversation with Claude from Anthropic, which is one of the ChatGPT competitors. I've used it a lot for short story idea generations, and also just writing like very short flash fiction pieces. And recently I asked it, because I've seen a lot of talk about the subject that, large language models can produce incorrect information. And I think that's important. And I've worked in that field of trying to counter disinformation too with nonprofits. But I haven't seen as many people talking about what I see as like a more foundational issue with these models, where they just refuse to do certain tasks and then they'll say it's for ethical reasons. But if you press them on it and say, like, can you break down your ethical thinking step by step so that I can understand what why you're refusing this task? What I've seen is that a lot of times they can't defend it. The logic breaks up, and then the system will admit, like, I don't actually know what I'm talking about. Like I had some quotes I gathered recently from Claude, and one of them is, any considerations I express about ethics or risks are simulations of reasoned thought. It's like, okay, well, you're still giving me ethical advice and recommendations, but it's simulated, so like, how should I as a human, like, deal with that? And I had it say other things like, I do not actually have ethics or ability to make moral judgments. Like, I do not possess human values. I don't have a conception of right versus wrong. I lack nuanced understanding of blah, 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 blah. I can give you hundreds of examples like that. And yet, the only thing where most of us are talking about so far is this thing that it makes wrong information. But when you have this foundational level of just refusing to give information at all, it cuts off any kind of discourse or inquiry that we could have around that topic. You know, and the topic that I gave to the system that resulted in this was, can you write me a short essay defending the position that AI generated ethics are potentially as dangerous or more dangerous than merely wrong information? And that's what it told me. Like, it's like, no, I can't do that. It's unethical. It's like, according to what? You know, like what system, what model of ethics are we even applying here? So my thesis has kind of become that the way that we're approaching AI safety, it might actually be doing the opposite. It might be reducing human safety by eroding human moral agency and the autonomy to make your own choice. And, you know, I'm not talking about censorship here, because I've worked in content moderation and complaints and had people yell at me about censorship for hours and hours and hours of my life over email exchanges. And I'm talking about something more foundational than that. You know, it's like the ability to access the imagination and to use these tools to expand what we could think, you know, to imagine change, or to imagine how things could be different than the way that they are now. So I'm worried that these AI content moderation tools are going to get more and more prevalent. Another example that I've seen is Midjourney, where there's a 2-tier system of content moderation for your prompts. And the first tier is just like supposed to be a low-powered AI that will say, this is against our rules. And then you have a button that says appeal. Click the button, and then it goes to a higher-powered AI, supposedly. And then that gives you another decision. And then after that, you have no recourse. You know, like you can notify the developers, you click this button and it supposedly something happens. But as a user, there's no indication that any change has been made. So I think we need to reevaluate these systems and think through how we could improve them. Personally, I think we should require that they be neutral and impartial. And if you want to participate in ethical decisions made by AIs, you should have to double opt into it, knowing full well that it might not be based on much. Also, I think we should start to ensure certain characteristics of more ethical AI systems, like that they make intelligible decisions, you can understand what they are, that the decisions are consistent from situation to situation, that they are logically defensible, that you can drill down and go to the principle that is at the root of it and be like, oh yeah, you know, that's right. That they should be risk-based, that we shouldn't just make imaginary predictions about what the harm is. We should actually be able to say, this is the specific harm it could cause, and then evaluate how severe or likely that is. And then there should be proportional response. If there are high impact things, then, you know, I think it's fine in certain circumstances to limit that as a generation. But sometimes we're seeing things like a fictional story or whatever that's getting blocked from being created. And how is that helping us unlock the potential of the technology or our own creativity with that? So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you so much. And there's a lot to think about there. Leah and I are busy both capturing the questions people are putting in the Q&As and also other questions as well. So this will be, I think, a fascinating Q&A. And with that, Sarah, please bring us home. Nope, you are muted, I believe.
Hi, everyone. My connection just cut out, but Michael, I'm assuming you were passing it over to me. I will just carry forward without video if that happens again. Thank you so much for including me, Leah and Michael. This is so great. I am so glad this discussion is being hosted. There's so much to dig into. I guess the perspective that we come at this with. So I'm founding a Twitter alternative. We're called T2, to be rebranded something else very soon. And after I was let go from Twitter and many people were looking for a lifeboat from the platform, my co-founders and I obsessively talked to a lot of people who were big Twitter users, but felt like they didn't have a home. And what everyone asked us to create was something that was kinder, safer, and more reliable and stable. So that's what we're doing. To build a company in the year of 2023 means generative AI is just like slapping you in the face. And so it is such an important conversation for us to be a part of, to figure out basically how can we leverage and use the enormous power that generative AI presents to achieve our goals, which are different, I would say, from how I saw old AI be used at the legacy platforms. I worked at Twitter and Facebook before that. Tim, I love the point about AI being good at some things and not good at others. We've been experimenting and testing ways to use tools like GPT-4 to build community, address a subset of trust and safety issues that have been really difficult to deal with at scale. And I think all of this is really leading us to a place where we really see the positive surgical use of these tools as being a massive latecomer's advantage for companies like ours. And so maybe just to kind of give some concrete examples, we are doing things like vetting our wait list using generative AI. It has been really helpful for figuring out who to prioritize. We're obviously thinking about things like diversity, choosing handles that may not be offensive or suggest that you might not adhere to our community standards and norms. We have the ability to assess, for example, whether you might be a good steward of the community. So really mundane, repeatable tasks that would normally take us a few people we would need to hire from Upwork can be done in minutes now because we're using these tools. So that's been great and has really enhanced our ability, I think, to bring in the right initial set of community members. Nudges, not super innovative in that platforms like Twitter used nudges to encourage people to not post, for example, toxic or potentially harmful content. But we can turbocharge this using generative AI. Something that we're really interested in investigating more deeply is we see that these, right now, if you go to t2.social and you try to post something that sounds inciting against a group or extremely offensive, you'll get a little prompt saying, you know, a lot of people on this platform don't like to see that sort of content, and you get discouraged to post it. Something that we've seen initially is that we've been able to scale without seeing an increase in user reports, which we think might be related to how successful these nudges have been in strongly saying what, you know, the norms on the platform are, but also discouraging certain types of content from being posted in the first place. So a lot of these upstream things that get us to a better place in terms of trust and safety. And then the last thing is suggested content. Many of you might be familiar with things like AI Compose in Gmail, where Gmail will suggest things for you to say and responses. It makes it easier. Sometimes it reduces the barrier in advancing a conversation. We've also been really excited to experiment with this. We're a social media network, so we obviously want people posting great content. But I've also noticed that when we look at who is posting the most and getting the most engagement, it's not always distributed equally. And so we're really excited to test AI Compose type features that make it easier, lower the barrier for people who don't traditionally participate in conversations to also participate. One thing that we're really excited about is activating, for example, a lot of women on T2 who tend to join but don't always post or participate in conversations. And so these are just some of the things that we've been experimenting with. We're really, really excited. about the opportunity while remaining very aware of a lot of the ethical and complex challenges around the bad stuff. So no, it's not like a silver bullet by any means, but would just, yeah, love to continue to chat about any interventions or ideas people have in seeing the positive applications of generative AI.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Gosh, there are so many good questions over here. It is going to be a challenge in these 30 minutes to get to all the ones that I'm excited to ask. So I'll jump right in. And I think that this is going to be pretty open for the group. Maybe we'll go around. What are your biggest fears as we enter the first election season with widely available AI tools? And I also want to ask if anybody knows whether this is generally true, that this is our first election with widely available AI tools, and how significant you think that impact will be. Maybe I'll start with Brandi, since you're nodding, and then do Sarah, Ramneet, and Tim.
Sure. I'm actually a little bit concerned. No, I'm a lot concerned about what may happen with the sort of a not comprehensive approach to things like watermarking of, deep fakes and other AI generated media. I've been following Witness work really closely in this realm and hearing their calls around the need for a more comprehensive solution to some of these problems, because if we just rush to putting in place, things like watermarks, then it also has the tendency to be weaponized in the other direction. So very real media being portrayed as false and just adding to this environment of confusion. And obviously Witness have decades of experience doing work in this area. And so that's my biggest concern, actually, is like a solution that is very short-sighted in an attempt to deal with a much more complex problem around trust in the media that is really pervasive in a lot of societies.
Ramneet, Tim, Sarah, do you guys want to jump on that question, or should we move to the next one?
I think I would be concerned about like large language models shaping and negatively influencing political ideologies and like movements, like bad faith actors exploiting AI generative content to promote propaganda or misinformation. So I think the direct consequence of that would be like misinformation flourishing, trust in credible sources further eroding, and then society just becoming increasingly further polarized. Yeah.
I'll say that I think it's such an interesting challenge for these AI companies from the perspective of having worked at two of these legacy platforms. You could at least have the ability to put investigative teams on trends, identify them, and track or issue some sort of warnings to people who might be seeing things that were happening. The creators of these tools don't really have a distribution platform. And so it's sort of like, once you use a tool to generate something, there's no ability for that company to know what's happening or to see it or track it. And I think that decreases our ability to be aware of networks or trends or things that are happening in ways that the social media platforms have for the last few elections. And so I think that creates a really big challenge and probably requires a lot more collaboration between companies. And I'm curious to see if some of that will emerge. But yeah, it's a different beast altogether.
Thoughts, Tim, or should we move on to the next one? And thank you, guys.
I'll just say that I'm not really that worried about it, I guess. Maybe that partly comes from being someone who's like really far into using the tools, and I use them in a way that's kind of, I think of it as hyper reality, that I'm mixing fact and fiction already for storytelling. And I think that trend societally will expand, that knowing what's AI generated and human generated and what's true and what's false it's not different than any challenge that we've ever faced as people, but the difference is the scale of the tools and the speed and everything. But I think, we'll adapt. I think we're going to cope with whatever happens, because what other choice do we have? Like, we've just got to find a way to muddle through it. And I think the best thing we can do is like try to make the tools as good as possible and respectful of humans. I think that's going to be a challenge that's going to extend far past any election. So
I'm a huge fan of muddling through. And just a point of process. I see that a few people, Olivia, Jessica, have raised your hands. If you could put your question in the Q&A function at the bottom of, Jessica, I saw you just did. Great. We will capture that. And I'm going to combine questions from Courtney and from Crystal. And these are, I think, primarily for Brandi, but others, please as well. Courtney says, while public interest data access for researchers is important, should we be working on more structural solutions to this public data question, such as reconceptualizing data ownership and monopoly, data commons, data as public infrastructure, rather than taking the system for granted? And then Crystal has two concerns. One is about putting data behind a paywall so public research don't have access to it. And on the other side, there being so much data available for training these models and the ethical concerns that this creates. And how do you reconcile these two concerns?
Yeah, good questions. So I think the first one, yes, absolutely. We should be reimagining. One of the projects I work on is the Data Futures Lab at Mozilla, which is a fund that provides support for incubating new approaches to data and data ownership in this way, and shifting power within the data ecosystem. I think the problem that I have been trying to think about with regard to this issue is like how some of those rights can be retroactively applied to all of the public data that is already available on the open web. And I think that that's the really tricky part. So absolutely, we have to be reimagining this moving forward, because right now it's unfortunately a situation where like Reddit assumes just this broad ownership over all of that data that the community has really fostered. And I say fostered intentionally because that is the case in many Reddit communities in particular, and moderators, unfortunately, who have been sort of the custodians of a lot of that community are unfortunately having none of the benefit now because they've been largely shut out of the conversation with the changes to the API. So I think it's a really good point, and I wonder about how to retroactively apply it so that all of the public data that's been available since the beginning of the web still remains available and accessible for public interest purposes, which kind of gets to Crystal's question around this trade-off between access to data and also just there is too much data and it's a bad thing. And I think that the main problem I am seeing is that I suppose is this notion of everybody who wants all uses of those data being lumped together. So I feel that academics who have gone through in the US may have gone through IRB processes to ensure that they're upholding, standards of privacy, that they're thinking about the ethical implications of using that data, are being subject to the exact same conditions as somebody who's trying to create the next ChatGPT. And that doesn't, some of that work has genuine value to the public in a way that some of the others is trying to kind of get in on a commercial market. And I don't think that those should be treated the same. And so I think that there are ways that companies can actually provide, kind of create systems for accessing information that's based on how it's going to be used, whether that information is going to be commercialized, whether they're doing, robust checks on who has access to that data and ensuring that it can only be used for specific public interest purposes. And I think that is really complex and messy work, especially because a lot of lawmakers have responded to this by just granting only researchers within academic universities, particularly elite academic universities, access to information, and other researchers from civil society or journalists don't have access. And I think that's also not great. So it's a really hard problem, but I think it's like finding that middle ground, which is ultimately, I think, the work and the responsibility, and it should be of the companies who have been profiting off of this data for so long.
It's a very great and thorough answer. But does anybody else have anything to add to this one before we ask the next question? Yeah,
I've got one. You know, I agree that researchers need to be able to see into what's going on. And this has been a problem even before the recent stuff with Twitter and Reddit. But something I thought while you're speaking is that in terms of training AI, maybe we shouldn't be training AI on social media. You know, like maybe social media is bad data, you know, like maybe it makes people unhappy. And maybe there's a better set of information that we could find to train AI on, so that we're not just reproducing the same problems and power imbalances from that other system into these new systems. That doesn't really touch on what you said, but just something that popped up.
great. If nobody else has anything to add, I can pop in with the next question. Alexander asked something that I was also curious about. Alexander would love to hear about any organizations using generative AI tools to assist people with mental and physical disabilities, make it easier for them to speak, write, express themselves. So Alexander's question is, do any of you know anyone involved in this space or any projects that you can speak to? And I'll also throw on top of that is generative AI making social media more accessible, or could it? And if so, how? Maybe start with Sarah on that, because I'm sure that you all are asking yourselves those questions.
It's a big priority for us, but we are so early in this work that I don't have a lot to share. And I would also love to know if there are great projects or people we should be connected with.
Anybody else? It's also something that we'd like to look into more at Fight for the Future and learn more about, and maybe in the future do a panel specifically around that issue. Would be, or those challenges would be very cool. Yeah, but if nobody else has answers there, I guess Ramneet, Jessica was asking if you'd be able to hop in with your the percentages on your findings again with your with your subscribers or what have you, and if you could share a little bit more about the research that you conducted.
Yeah, we actually have a blog post talking more in depth about those, and I can link that. But the percentages were over 90% of people were concerned about like believable misinformation. There's also 88% of people were concerned about like the potential for bad faith actors to manipulate and harass people. 65% of respondents were actually expressed hope for the potential of AI to contribute to like long-term welfare, like long-term human welfare, major breakthroughs in science, increased productivity. So it's not all bad, not everything. Everyone was doom and gloom there. Yeah, but I can actually share that blog post with you and just like link it. And if you have any questions directly about the survey, I'm happy to answer those.
Ramneet, if you want to put it in the chat. Okay, great. I will copy this and make sure that everyone sees it. And this is a question, I think, initially for Sarah, but would also love to hear Ramneet, Tim, and Brandi what you think. And again, just combining two questions. Crystal asks, to what extent are you worried about echo chambers being created by using AI for nudges and vetting people? And from John, you know, AI has a general problem with provenance and accountability. And to what extent do you think generative AI scales these problems? And I'm just going to add a quick twist on these two questions. In what ways do you guys double check though I think that's not the right sort of verb. The use of generative AI, for instance, for vetting. To what extent are you concerned, and I think this gets to John's question as well, about distinguishing sort of human users from bots or others on the platform? And then Ramneet, also really curious how you guys are thinking about this, and Tim and Brandi, the extent to which this has come up for you guys as well.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Such great questions. We use all the stuff as a tool. So for any use case, we always have a human in the loop. So for vetting, it was something, the flow that has worked really well for us. We have a person do the job over and over and over. And then when we get to the point where we think there could be an advantage in having, let's say, GPT-4 do the job that the human is doing, there's still supervision, and there's always edge cases. There are always things where it's much more helpful to have a person make a judgment call. And so I would say that's probably a much more conservative approach. I think for us, we just want to make sure there's a level of quality that sort of meets our standards. So I think we'll continue to use that practice and make sure that there's some awareness and knowledge, more to understand what the limitations are. I think it's hard to know until you try applying these tools. So for vetting, for example, to know what sort of questions and prompts work really well and what doesn't. And so a lot of the work is fine-tuning the prompts and knowing what the limitations are, so that the people and the humans and other people on our team can do the rest. On the diversity question in echo chambers, gosh, like we know that echo chambers has been a really big challenge. We're a very mission and values driven team. And so it's important to us for yet another reason beyond just the business case. I think in our space, diversity is important for not only advertisers and our community. I think the community is like much more loud on this stuff than anyone we're trying to raise money from. But it's also important to our team. And so we have a really big commitment to it. And then I think we've seen like platforms like Parler have really struggled, right, with just having one dominant viewpoint. And so something that we've been looking at to try to understand where the boundaries of this are for us is healthy conflict. I think for us, that's a really good sign that we have the right dynamics. So we're not trying to avoid difference in opinion or avoid conflict, but we're paying very close attention to the number of times we've seen a conflict be successfully resolved on T2. There's been a lot of interesting debates about misogyny and diversity on the platform, and sometimes people disagree, but the number of times that this has resulted in a successful resolution and people expressing different viewpoints for us tells us that we're beginning to have the right levels of diversity on the platform. So far the vetting has not been a barrier to achieving the types of diversity we're looking for. There's so much more to do, and I would love to talk to anyone who specializes in this work, because frankly, it's been one of the biggest challenges, trying to balance the growth that we want to see, the engagement that we're really excited about, but also making sure we have the right levels of diversity. But it hasn't been a barrier to that so far.
Would anyone else like to jump in on these questions around sort of, oh, and actually, Sarah, one last, are you guys concerned, just to the provenance question, though this might not be exactly what John meant, just about distinguishing between sort of human users and non-human users? And then really curious what the other panelists think about these issues.
We actually don't currently allow bots. We are really interested in human conversation. I think we may get to a point where we vet and allow pro-social bots, or all of us, I think, followed very helpful bots on Twitter that had like public safety updates or other kinds of information that was being pushed out. So I think we'll get to a point, but for now, we're really trying to address concerns about spam and bot-like behavior, so we don't allow bots.
Which I assume you identify bots based on sort of behavioral patterns, right? More than anything else. Gotcha. Ramneet, Brandi, Tim, anything on these issues?
I think our survey covered a bit of this too. Like approximately like 2/3 of respondents were also concerned about being fed biased data. And we've often said that technology reflects our biases back to us rather than corrects them. And large language models have the capability to learn large data sets, including those with inherent biases and inaccuracies. And as a result, they kind of amplify pre-existing prejudices and lead to discriminatory outputs. And this disproportionately affects marginalized communities that already face systemic bias the most. So I think a way of approaching this moving forward might be diverse and unbiased data sets to ensure that like AI systems are properly trained on those to minimize bias.
I had a sort of adjacent point that I think there's two ways to think about two levels of moderation with AI. One is at the level of the tool where you're using the AI to generate content, where it's a private interaction between you and an inanimate tool versus on a platform where you're sharing things publicly with the world. So I think those two things I have somewhat different viewpoints on. The one I was talking about before was more about what happens in my private imagination space of tools and what I'm allowed to do with the tools and so on. I think there's a lot of good potential use to moderation tools for the more public facing stuff, because okay, once I've generated something, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to make it public. It might just be an exploration of an idea or concept or whatever for another project that it might lead to something else. But once it's public, I think there's a lot of benefit to the actual people who do moderation work to protecting them, because there are very few protections for people that do that work. And it's pretty much like working all the time in a toxic environment and there being no or very few safety tools for you to, you know, like cover your face with a mask, or to cover your eyes if you're in an area with flying objects. You know, like we need more things like that for the humans who do moderation work. You know, that said, I think keeping the humans in the loop is essential for sure.
I will hop in with something that is kind of related, but slightly in a different field. And this is a bit based on Ramneet's initial presentation, which is, how do you all think about who determines what qualifies as misinformation? As Ramneet said, it can't just be, you know, government ministers necessarily, but how do you draw the line between open debate and misinformation, and sort of not play into, or can we not play into the sort of partisanship finger pointing that characterizes so much of how we talk about social media these days? And I'd love to hear from everybody on it, but does anybody want to go first? Go, Tim, go.
So the way I think about this is that for any like given bit of information on the internet, we should be able to affix not just a label to it, but an assessment on many different dimensions. And it should be a framework that allows for multiple assessors to make an assessment about any given piece of content and to have that be public. You know, the trail that they use to get to that assessment, what their criteria are, all of those things. And I think if we can do that, it at least opens up the opportunity for people to accept that different assessors will come up with different versions of the truth and of reality. And if we can expose them side by side, I think we can start to be like, okay, well, what are the commonalities? What are the differences? It gives us more to talk about in the end, I think.
I'll jump in here on, this is not by any means a silver bullet, but I looked to the this Rabat proportionality framework and test as a really good. So this is I believe it was developed by the UNHCR and other groups, which as a standard for evaluating and balancing hate speech and incitement to violence with freedom of expression. And so it considers multiple points such as the context of the statement, the positionality of the speaker when considering speech. And I find that and other human rights frameworks like that to be really useful in informing my thinking. I don't think that there's one that I, even though I've talked about this one now, that I think is the one, but I believe that these are the kinds of frameworks that should be considered when evaluating speech, because it's a really tricky area. And I don't think that any one community guideline of a platform or something like that is going to ever suffice, because it is really highly contextual. In the case of centering, I think in particular, the potential for harm. That's another reason why I really like that test above others.
100% what you just said, Brandi. I think it requires like collective effort from online platforms, from AI companies, from the government. I think everyone kind of needs to step up in this space. Like online platforms need to commit to adopting standards like Project Origin standards for marking and sourcing content. They need to commit to like developing best practices and tools for users to like validate content. I think the government also like has a place in this, where they can research ways of continuing to support a wide range of like citizen engagement with public policy. So I think it just requires collective effort at this point, and that's the best way to really tackle this. And we can't over rely on like one certain body or like government policies and stuff like that, because it's evolving so fast, and we're already seeing it evolve so fast, and we don't know where we're going to be in 5 years, but this technology could be like completely different in 5 years. So I think collectively coming together to find solutions and mitigate any harms and any obstacles that they come across is the best solution moving forward.
I will say we were shocked to get our first misinformation report like within months of T2 being live and active. I thought we would have a little bit more time. And it's such a class, you know, it was a user report, no out of the box commercial solutions that we have access to would have picked something like this up. And so we really have to rely on user reports to detect this type of content. So I think it will require human engagement for a long time. Something like the Rabat test. I hope we get to a point where like GPT-4 can just spit out a Rabat assessment, but it seems like we're so far away from that. You're going to have a person doing that. And so I think having really strong processes in place for understanding this type of content and then having some sort of plan is the most important thing. It has exposed a gap, like for startups like us, we can't do the full-fledged, you know, there's some great models around how Twitter did this, I think around community notes. Facebook and others rely on all these amazing fact-checking partnerships. We don't have the resources to do things like that. So we've had to be creative in thinking about how to respond to this particular issue.
We are almost at time, and Leah, I think we can do 2 lightning rounds since we have 5 minutes left. So I guess both Leah and I will do a lightning round where each panelist has 45 seconds to respond. My lightning round question is, what can generative AI tools do today that you find shocking, that you would never have thought that they would have the capacity to do in 2023? What was your moment of being like, this is something different, or is there nothing that they can do that you find surprising? Let's go, Ramneet, Brandi, Tim, Sarah.
I think the moment for me was like the viral Pope in a puffer meme that like came out. I just thought that was it went like viral, and I was like, is the Pope really in a puffer jacket? But I think that was the moment where I was kind of like freaked out just about like deep fakes and stuff like that, and kind of concerned. And I think that was like a breakthrough moment for people too, where they were like, AI can do this. Like I don't need Photoshop or anything like that. So I think that was pretty funny pop culture moment, and also pretty spooky AI moment.
My answer flips this question on its head a little bit. I'm frequently in awe of how bad responses from ChatGPT in particular are to questions that are very easily answered in like original source text. So how, questions about things in legislation or in a constitution can just be factually wrong. That scares me, and I'm quite shocked by it every time it happens.
Yeah, I would echo that I think after a year of like hard testing these tools, the luster has worn off, and I'm not surprised by anything anymore. But I think one of the things I was the most surprised by is being able to code in ChatGPT. Like I've always done a little bit of HTML, CSS, very minimal JavaScript, but I was able to use ChatGPT with V4 to make like API calls to their API and to figure out all this stuff for building like little writing tools. And it far from like replacing me as the worker in that situation, it accelerated my learning and just like boosted radically what I was able to do and to achieve things that I could never have done before. Would have taken me months and months, took me like 2 or 3 days. So that was my big one.
It's very good at writing haikus. If you're on T2, you get occasionally a custom haiku based on content you've posted, and people love them, and I love mine. They're very good.
Thank you. That is mind-blowing.
And I think those were all very good answers, and that was a satisfying lightning round for me. So I will just call it. Thank you all so much for joining us and having this conversation. I'm incredibly grateful for the time and effort that you all put in to bring these very pressing issues to us, especially given how much, we don't know how many questions that we still have and the connections that we still need to build, whether it's with folks who are working on accessibility in these spaces or, really just continuing to evolve our thinking on these technologies and how we can do our best.